everyone, so in this video we're going to be going over the status effect Trauma. Now, Trauma recently got a pretty big update, and I think it is a much more effective ability to use now in combat. Now, it is a very unique ability where the enemy ends up taking unmitigated, so flat damage, based on each negative status effect that is either resisted or unnaturally recovered. So an example of a toon unnaturally recovering from a status effect would be if a toon is infected and you use Steve's active skill to recover infection. That would put out one flat amount of trauma damage based on how much trauma was applied to the toon times 1, because there's one ability that is being recovered. Now, trauma would also be triggered if you had to recover from all penalties or recover from negative status effects, but infection, if it's recovered by healing your toon, that is considered a natural way of recovering from infection, meaning that toon will not sustain any trauma damage. Overall, almost every single status effect is linked to a turn counter, meaning if a toon naturally recovers by waiting out the number of turns as written in the ability, they will not take any trauma damage. But if there's any way that they recover from it, so by an active skill, by a rush, by a weapon, just by any sort of unnatural ability, trauma will immediately take place, and trauma can be a huge hit because trauma can actually be stacked. It's one of the few abilities that actually can be stacked, and for every single negative effect that is recovered, it'll be a flat amount, and trauma is almost always at a very high number of damage that it can apply. It's just also very circumstantial, but it's become less circumstantial because of its update, where if a toon resists a status effect, they will also take trauma damage. Now, there is a number of toons that can apply trauma, and most of them are free-to-play toons, to be honest. We're going to focus only on the S-class characters, because there are some 6-star characters like Zhai Fang comes to mind, Kyle comes to mind, but their trauma damage is at a lower value, and being in the S-class era, like trauma, it's a very specific type of way to apply damage. We will probably want a tankier team, kind of like the same idea as how a bleed team, an infection team, a burn team you don't really see much of, but the point is you will generally want to have a tankier team that can apply a lot of status effects to the enemy. The enemy's team, primarily you'll want them to recover from penalties, so certain things that I would look for are toons that do recover from different penalties. A common one for say is Pete. On Pete's active skill, he recovers maim from toons on his team. The downside is he does heal before the trauma takes place, but trauma is a great way to do unmitigated damage and can be a great way to finish off some toons. I think what I like about trauma the most is that there are so many things that can trigger it. We're thinking about bleed, we're thinking about burn, hemobleed, daze, normalize, stun, confuse, impair, heal reduction, taunt, more trauma, exhaust damage, maim damage. The list really goes on and on, like attack down and defense down are also options. There's just so many ways that you could trigger it now, ever since they added in when you resist an effect. And it's kind of nice that all these characters that I'm showing you are free-to-play characters that everyone could have picked up. So it is reasonable that anyone could make a trauma team. So like what I was saying before about trauma stacking, we saw that Willy, when he rushes, he does 4,000 trauma. Angel, when she rushes, does 3,000 trauma. Therefore, if a toon gets hit with both amounts of damage, they have 7,000 trauma. And that means for every single thing that they recover from unnaturally, they're taking 7,000 flat damage. This can escalate to very high heights very quickly. Now, to address the toon that has been confusing a lot of players, Willy. Willy has a 66 AP rush, when he rushes a line of enemies, get 4,000 trauma, stun, and 50% heal reduction for 2 turns. This character regains up to 100% HP, so great. Pretty straightforward. We're applying 3 debilitating effects, trauma at 4,000, stun, and heal reduction. If anyone ends up recovering from stun and or heal reduction, they'll take 4,000 trauma damage per recovery, but they won't take trauma damage of any sort if a trauma is recovered. Trauma is always recovered last in the group of effects if there's a recover all penalty in place. Now, what people have been confused about with Willy is that his active skill actually ends up helping the enemy. This character regains up to 100% of their max HP, and a line of enemies recover from all penalties. At first, a lot of people thought that Willy was broken. Like, why would you want to recover the enemies? But it all has to do with trauma. Let's say on turn 2, you rush a line, apply 4,000 trauma, stun, and heal reduction. If you end up using Willy's active skill the next turn, and you recover the trauma, the stun, and the heal reduction from that line, and just those 3 debilitating status effects, the enemy will take 8,000 flat damage because of the recovery from heal reduction and stun and trauma to finish it off. Now, if you use another toon and say apply a stun, or even like a 5 bleed or 5 burn to either of those toons before you recover them, that's an additional 4,000 trauma damage taken that would have only cost them 5 bleed damage. It's really incredible how powerful trauma can be. And just for context, we're going to look at almost all the S-class toons that have an ability that lets them either recover or resist status effects. And as you can probably believe, this list is very extensive. We're going to start off with Axel because as a leader, he provides 100% stun resistance for the first 2 turns. So if you stun anyone on the opponent's team and they have any trauma, they're going to resist the stun but take trauma damage immediately. Axel's active skill, all teammates recover from impair. That's a huge one as well because that's another recovery. So if trauma is applied, they're going to take trauma damage. This Michonne, recover from all penalties. And then her weapon, 100% confused resistance. This can also cause trauma to be triggered. Now Traitor, he is a huge one for this. Now you only have a 50% chance to actually apply trauma, but if you do, just keep whacking at him. He has a 50% chance to resist all status effects, and with his combat mods, he sometimes has 2 resistances. So for one resistance is heal reduction, and you try to apply heal reduction and he resists it, bam, there's trauma damage. If you attack him and try to apply a small bleed mod, and he resists the bleed mod, bam, more trauma damage. Traitor will cause so much trauma damage to occur, it's ridiculous. And it's actually mind-boggling to me how extensive his S-class list is of toons that recover from some sort of ability. And based on the recent trends, we're seeing a lot of 100% resistance toons. If we keep on seeing these 100% resistance toons, well, if any of them end up being a leader toon or something, it'll be very easy to predict what type of team you can attack with. So long as you apply trauma damage and let's say they resist taunt the whole time. Well, let's go in there with our trauma toons and then also go in with our taunting toons. We apply trauma, we attempt to taunt the enemy resists 100% of the time. That's going to be flat trauma damage each and every time. There's so many ways to manipulate it, and the more toons we see coming out, the more recovering of different abilities we see. So this is where understanding and kind of remembering what different characters do, how important that can be. Because your trauma toons are always going to be your trauma toons, but it's your supporting toons and what type of abilities you put on them. So you might use an impair on attack weapon, or if someone has 100% impair resistance in the future or something, what about running frost on attack with an impair weapon when taking damage and having those trauma toons? Every time they resist the impair, they get trauma damage. there just seems to be so many ways to manipulate it. And this is definitely going to be confusing and hard to remember because I am not an encyclopedia for this game. I can't remember what every single character does. What I do try to do is remember what some of the more common characters do, because it helps make me a better player. And in all honesty, I don't think trauma is going to become the new meta. It's still very specific, and you'd have to trigger it manually. So if we got more toons kind of like Willy that can recover penalties from the enemy, I can see it becoming a bigger problem for players. But at this time, with just Willy being able to recover penalties from the enemy, I just see trauma as being a difficult concept, and I feel like there are easier ways to get through some teams. Now, I do think that it could be done well, and it would take some practice and time, but this is a niche market. It would be a very specific type of team that you would want to run, and you would have to learn it very, very well. You would have to understand what all the defensive toons do when you go about attacking them. So in this first quick example, I just want to exemplify quickly how trauma can be utilized. So Michonnes give 100% confused resistance. I end up rushing my Ivanova to apply 2000 trauma. I attack with my confounding toon. They resist the confuse, of course, and they took 2000 trauma right away. Now in this next attack, we're going to take a look at how Traitor kind of reacts to all of this. His resilient ability makes him susceptible to many, many things, but I think the biggest issue is ensuring that trauma is applied to Traitor. Now, someone could just add a 50% trauma resistance mod, and then the Traitor would be immune to trauma, and you would never be able to add trauma to him, meaning you would never be able to get a trauma kill. Now, what I'm doing with this team, I'm trying to apply trauma with my Ivanova again, and or with my Willy. Now, I was successful with Ivanova, which is nice, and now what I'm doing with my Willy, I'm going to a basic attack and then rush him, and Traitor takes 2000 damage twice because he resists a couple different things from Willy, including the trauma damage, the trauma and the stun. Finally, Priya attacks, and she's able to take out Traitor, and you saw 2000 more trauma damage, and that's from resisting the maim damage from her weapon. So another ability or weapon that has decreased in value because of trauma, in my opinion at least, is the red cleanse weapon. Now this we're just going to test on Pete, just to show that the cleanse weapon can actually work against you instead of for you. So Pete cleanses himself, but I don't have any trauma applied yet. Now by applying trauma and applying stun, Ivanova gives more trauma and defense down. He recovers from the defense down and takes 6000 trauma damage. And now it's kind of just a walk in the park. I use Willy's active skill to recover the last two, and he takes 12,000 damage. It's a really interesting way to actually defeat an enemy because you're using passive moves kind of like Infection. And now we added in S-Class Shiva on the defensive team. Priya still has a maim on attack weapon, so we're going to try to apply both trauma, and then we're going to apply some maim damage to watch how Pete recovers from the maim damage. And with Pete recovering the maim damage, he heals the toon, but he also causes them to take flat damage. And this can be pretty effective on a lot of different teams because you know how often or when certain toons use their active skills or use their rushes, and you know how to trigger them. Pete always uses his active skill on the second turn. So if you can apply some maim damage to everyone on the opponent's team, like how Zach used to do that, it could be a very effective way at taking down some somewhat tanky teams, but you still need that trauma damage to be applied, which could be a limiting factor. I think in the future, it's possible that we could see a trauma leader. It just seems like we're seeing a lot of different RNG leaders, but then we're also seeing some ways to combat RNG itself. Like right now, Michonne, 100% confuse resistance. What Priya does on her rush, she applies confuse to a line of enemies. Unfortunately, he or she got stunned, but I'm pretty sure you guys can understand the premise behind it and how effective it could be. Now, I specifically rushed Willy on the 2 characters and Ivanova just on Pete, because Willy would be applying 4,000 trauma to 2 toons, while Ivanova only applies 2,000 to 1. I could have doubled down and just applied the 6,000 onto Michonne as well as Shiva, but I thought may as well spread it around and see how effective it could be. Now, there wasn't many things to recover from off of these 2 characters, which is why Shiva is still alive. I needed to apply some other status effects to her for this to be effective. Now, this team that I'm running at the moment, this is not a normal attack team. I made it specifically for this video just to kind of showcase what trauma is, how to utilize it, and I think it just gives people a better idea to see the power of it and how to utilize it. I think that in the future I might make myself a trauma team. I'm not exactly sure using what characters yet, but it's definitely on my radar. So now in this go, we're really going to try and apply that confuse to the enemy, which we know is going to fail, but that's the point. You can see that I apply maim damage on my basic attacks with Priya, and now we're going to set it up where Priya is going to apply hopefully confuse to the enemy, and by confuse I mean the trauma damage. We should see confuse immunity come up, so there's the 2,000 trauma damage right away. We see the confuse immunity come up above Priya's symbol in the bottom left hand corner. So this is a pretty effective method, I think. The more all-out resistance toons that we see, excluding trauma resistance, of course, could make some interesting combinations. Again, the more that you know, so the more you understand different characters, the more you can try to manipulate them for your own advantage. So now just to spark notes it all. By applying trauma to an enemy toon, for every penalty or debilitating status effect that is unnaturally recovered, meaning by an active skill, by a rush, by a weapon, this will deal flat damage to the enemy for every single penalty that is recovered. Trauma can also be stacked, meaning if 2 toons can provide trauma, those 2 numbers will actually add together and create a higher value, and every penalty that is recovered is multiplied by that value, excluding trauma itself. Trauma can also be triggered if the enemy toon resists a certain status effect, and this works great against toons that have 100% resistance or immunity. Right now we just have Axel with his 100% stun resist, we have Michonne with her 100% confuse resist, and we have Traitor where his resilient makes up 50%, and any mods that are over or equal to 50% make him completely immune. So everyone, I hope this video gave you a better idea about how you can actually use trauma, what toons you can use, and how you can utilize it in battle. I'm very interested to know if any of you guys will actually be utilizing trauma, because I do see it as a viable way of taking down toons like the Traitor, who, as I mentioned, have that 100% resistance. Moreover, he has a 50% resistance to everything else you can think of. So I think he would be a prime target for a lot of free-to-play players to try trauma on, at least. It might not work every time, but it still works some of the time. Anyway, thank you everyone for watching and listening to my video. Sorry that this one was so long, it's just I wanted to be very specific and get in depth about the ability trauma.